Hi, my name is Eric, and this is my presentation on populism in Europe, which I did for my capstone paper in my political science major. So the inspiration for this project was inspired by the phenomenon of the creeping authoritarianism that we see in many European countries, including Poland and Hungary, where we see some erosions of things like freedom of the press and the independence of the judiciary and things of that nature. This was exacerbated by the 2008 financial crisis and the Mediterranean refugee crisis that was fueled by conflicts in places like Syria and North Africa and North and Central Africa. My research in particular focuses on the phenomenon of populism, which, as you can see, is a style of appeal which pits pure people against corrupt or unresponsive elites. This this appeal has no political orientation. It's a method by which to carry a larger a more substantive message. The two main explanations that are given for this is economic grievance. So grievance is based on economic position and standing and things like labor and unemployment and things like that, and social cultural threat, which things like people's social standing or cultural identity that they may feel is under threat. So my research question is, which of these two main predictors is the stronger predictor for support for populist parties in Europe: social cultural threat or economic grievances? And my hypothesis is that support for populist parties will be higher in places that experience high levels of cultural threat and lower levels of education, regardless of economic conditions. And I'll get to why I believe that, or why I originally believed that in my literature review. So here's my literature review. I've divided it up into four main categories. The first category is vulnerability and status loss. Status loss is the idea that one has lost a previously privileged position in society. That may be an economic position or some social prestige position that a group of people may have held in a society that they fear that they do not anymore. Populist leader appeals are most likely to convince the so-called losers of globalization. These are people who don't have the skill level or the educational attainment to compete in the job market in a more globalized world. Support for populism is also correlated with feelings of vulnerability, either whether they be economic vulnerability or social vulnerability. And another contributing factor is the erosion of the traditional party function. The political party traditionally acts as sort of a bridge between the people, the population, and the government, the state, and the state apparatus. As the European Union, as European integration takes place, and the EU becomes more technocratic, it becomes becomes more divorced from the people as a whole, and that's this is the phenomenon that this is eroding the traditional party function in society. The second thing is economics versus culture. Regions most likely affected by Chinese import shocks are more likely to support economic nationalist or radical right-wing parties, according to these two researchers. And then, however, so that's an economic phenomenon. However, many parties still emphasize cultural denationalization, this fear that their identity is going to sort of disappear, is going to be taken away from them, and they'll be cease to be a nation, essentially. This researcher found that anti-immigrant attitudes were based on fears about immigration's effects on society, not necessarily based on whether or not they're going to have to compete with them in a job market situation, let's say. So those are argument for that social cultural threat is more strongly correlated with support for populism. However, anti-egalitarian attitudes are more strongly related to support for right-wing parties in Europe than social cultural attitudes. So there's a very vigorous debate among the research that has already been done on this topic. It's very not. And another big predictor, another very strong predictor of support for populism is education. People with less education are more likely to support populism, even though this is explained as a fear of lower wage workers coming to compete in the labor market. Less educated people still score higher for ethnocentric attitudes and for hostility to outgroups. So that's not necessarily based on simply labor market competition. And now in Eastern Europe, in the post-communist countries, there's a very particular set of circumstances. Whereas in Western Europe, the political parties have sort of become divorced from the population as a whole. The parties in Eastern Europe have suffered from insufficient institutionalization. They have not, since the fall of communism in the late 80s and early 90s, they have not existed for long enough and been effective enough to sort of gain the legitimacy that they need to be effective, or to gain that sort of support, like sort of long-standing support. A content analysis of the platforms of right-wing parties in Europe or in Eastern Europe they share these concerns about clericalism, about concern about ethnic minorities, and a concern about irredentism. So it creates this sort of what this scholar terms as post-communist syndrome. And this is also coupled with fears about demographic collapse. So in Eastern Europe, you have a lot of younger people moving out of countries, leaving these countries to go to either Western Europe or somewhere else for job opportunities and more economic opportunities. So you also have an aging population, so that this precipitates a sort of a demographic time bomb, essentially, that there's very much a lot of concern about. And then there's also this pressure in the post-Soviet world, or in the post-communist world, to imitate the style of governance that a lot of Western countries have. So there's a sort of, it's a stance that they take that the West is the best, basically, and that they have the proper standards for good governance, the proper practices for good governance, and that the East is behind and that they should basically catch up. So that's sort of the attitude, and there's a lot of pressure for these states to meet those expectations that have been placed on them. So my data methods, what I did is I sampled the 27 European Union member states plus Norway, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. My dependent variable was the total vote share for populist parties in each country's most recent national election. So that's across the political spectrum. That's every party. You add the percentages together, and you have the number that I used, because I'm more concerned about the appeal and not really the content. And then my independent variables were economic deprivation, gratification, immigration, anti-religious minority sentiment, post-communism, and feelings of social cultural superiority. The anti-religious minority sentiment was measured by the answer to the question, being a Christian is an important part of being blank, being whatever nationality. And then feelings of social cultural superiority were measured by affirmative responses to the answer to the question, all cultures have good, but my culture is superior to others, or something along to that. Maybe not exactly that wording, but that question in effect was what was being responded to. So these are my findings. I did a multivariate regression analysis for all these independent variables, and I found that none of them were statistically significant, except for this post-communist syndrome, which is this post-communist variable, which is a dichotomous variable. So I coded 0 for having no communist rule in the past, and 1 for the presence of communist rule in the past. And this is what it came up with. Obviously, you can see that it's statistically significant at the 0.05 level, and everything else is not. There's no significant other significant relationships here, which was very surprising to me, because there were some variables that I thought would come out be very strong, especially this education one. I think that was probably the most surprising to me. So my conclusions are, obviously, I failed to find a significant relationship between the dependent variable and any of the independent variables besides that dichotomous post-communist variable. And that leads to the suggestion that there's something categorically different going on in those countries. There's something very particular about them and their political culture and their history, their context that they exist in, that causes this to happen in a way that's very different than that in Western Europe. But I'll need to do further studies to use more observations over time. So maybe do a time series analysis of different elections over a period of time. So it'll give me more observations, and maybe some significant relationships will come up then. I also had a lot of missing data. I plan to use this scale that Pew Research puts out called the Nationalist Anti-Immigrant and Anti-Minority Scale. It's basically a battery of questions that are battery of yes or no questions, and it assigns basically a weighted score to affirmative responses to give you a 1 to 10 score on this scale. I was not able to use that because there weren't enough countries sampled for it to be useful in this study, especially. So I think if I can find some more data about using this scale from all the other countries that currently don't have it, and I do a time series analysis, so I gain more observations, I would expect to yield some more significant relationships to sort of better disentangle these two competing ideas about what causes people to support populism in Europe, in these places. So, okay, well, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you guys for listening.